Hey Kage, back again. Today we're gonna check out this article about does Final Fantasy 16 even want to be a video game. Let's get to it. Final Fantasy 16 opening is slow and indulgent and often resents you for trying to play it. I played about 4 hours of Final Fantasy 16, although played is a generous interpretation for what I did with that time. I've fought a few things, all gigantic things to boot, but mostly I have watched and watched and watched and listened and never enjoyed. I love narrative games, usually, but Final Fantasy 16 is not a narrative game simply because it is loaded with exposition. There has been a lot of discussion about whether Final Fantasy 16 wants to be an RPG or an action game, or a combination of both. But at times it feels like it barely wants to be a video game at all. Interesting. You played 4 hours. 2 hours alone is just a demo. And the extra 2 hours after that is maybe after your first major ending of the battle, after the time skip. So you basically just barely scratched the surface of the game. You haven't gone anywhere. You haven't unlocked nothing. So you did the demo stuff, which is that one dungeon and the one primal battle. That's not at all enough to get into this game. This game is long, and this game has a lot of cutscenes. I agree with it, but at the same time, it's how Final Fantasy 16 chooses to tell its story through cutscenes. For example, I'm playing Trails of Cold Steel currently, and they have a lot of story to tell, but all of that is mostly written story. You have to read it, so it's just for Final Fantasy 16, instead of you have to sit through and read through texts, you have cutscenes. Now it comes to the preference whether you want to sit there and read the text or you want to watch a cutscene. My opinion, cutscenes are good. I also don't mind text, but I know people who don't like text stuff because they read slowly, and in turn they do not enjoy the stuff as much as they would have if it was voiced, for example. So cutscenes can be a good thing. Maybe with you reading the text it feels like you're more involved than just watching a cutscene, but that's to each own's preference. Let's continue. The opening exchanges are full of meaty cutscenes that are all gristle. If there's a subtle subtext, these scenes that will reveal itself in time, that gristle will taste like sour grapes to me. I think the food metaphors are coming from the highly obvious banquet scenes, but I can't imagine they will. Each piece of dialogue is drawn out, delivered in overly jovial fashion, trying to pull us into a non-existent joke. It's all surface level, with any twists exceedingly obvious. It wants us to sit back and be amazed, but it fails to amaze us. Personally, had no issues like this, but I'm not this person who played the game for 4 hours, so I don't know. Okay, Final Fantasy 16 is open about being inspired by Game of Thrones, but it seems to possess a glib understanding of George R.R. Martin's works. Game of Thrones was about power imbalance, societal inequality, and the dangers of unchecked cruelty and ambition. Chaos, after all, is a ladder. Final Fantasy 16, at least, is the first 4 hours, has only blood and dinner parties. Game of Thrones deliberately usurped and conformed to expectations of women, the unknown power of the underclass, the mystique of rule, and the power of wards. Final Fantasy 16 has barely any women, barely any underclass, no real examination of its rulers, and the less said about the wards, the better. This is as much inspired by Game of Thrones as those old memes of Ned Stark are. Eventually, it leans on a crutch of gameplay, but does so reluctantly. Playing as Joshua feels forced, and then the Akon battle in the sky is too long and too cinematic, much like the Star Wars bike chase earlier this year. The stakes dissolve into nothing when it is so clearly a scripted event that resents the players pushing buttons. The tutorial combat with Clive against the goblins is the most we get let off the leash, and that fight stops every other swing to teach you the rules. I know it gets better, I heard everybody say it. Maybe across the next 4 or 14 or 40 hours something will click and I will get it. That still doesn't feel like an excuse for what Final Fantasy XVI makes us sit through. This is not a masterful work of complex genius where all of the pieces slowly line up into something magnificent later on. This is a drawn-out exercise in self-indulgence that we shouldn't have had to sit through. I'm sure the gameplay ahead of me is sprawling and epic. I know Final Fantasy XVI reviewed strongly and is seen as key evolution for the series, but if this is to be the blueprint, it needs to get over itself. Well, it does get better, definitely, but I wouldn't even say it's that long. You just need to pass the next fight after the time skip and you get to slay as many enemies as you want with no tutorials interrupting you whatsoever. But again, if you don't want to sit through a story rich game that has a lot of story, you don't have to. Don't play the game. Go for a less narrative game instead of story rich games that often indicate that you will have a lot of story to listen to or read to. But yeah, let's continue. A slow burn is fine. Some games, either deliberately to build up atmosphere or as a result of feeling its way through a new structure, take a while to get going. In some cases, this slow start makes it easier to absorb the world and benefits the whole experience. Final Fantasy XVI is not a slow burn, it's just slow. It is arrogant enough to believe the title of the box will keep you engaged as it forces you to sit back on the sofa and watch a school play interpretation of HBO show. Unfortunately, it's probably correct. Technically, it doesn't force you to. If you don't want to watch the cutscenes, there is an option to skip it. Just skip it. If you don't want to watch all the cutscenes that tell you about the characters, about the world, or any other piece of information that's there, just skip it. Get to the gameplay part. You don't like a narrative game like this? Don't listen to the narrative. Go to the gameplay. Alright, that's it for today, guys. See you guys.